Welcome back to Common Sense. I'm Representative Patricia Morgan, and we have today with us Don Allen, who is a parent of 4 children, and as a parent of 4 children in public schools, you've become really, really involved in making sure your kids get a great education.
Yes.
And very concerned about the Common Core standards. You've done a whole lot more investigation of the standards than I have. Why are you concerned about them? Where do you think they fall down?
Well, I turned my attention to a few folks that have experience with standards writing and were very vocal against what they saw was happening with these Common Core standards. If my memory serves me right, there was about 28 or so people that wrote the standards. Very few of them had any real education background and no real standards writing history in their resumes. Mm-hmm. The validation committee that was set up to assess whether these standards were good or not were comprised again of people that didn't really have educational backgrounds. 2 in particular did.
So they weren't classroom teachers?
Correct, right. There was a few, I want to say 4 or 5 were on the standards writing team that had some classroom experience. I don't believe the elementary school years were represented properly. But someone like Sandra Stotsky, who wrote the English language arts standards for Massachusetts, or James Milgram, who was a mathematician who had history of writing math standards, both refused to sign off on these Common Core standards, saying that they're lacking in many respects. And I turned to their analysis to understand, what is wrong with these standards, and then looked even further than that. There was a letter written back in 2010 by 400 early educational specialists that all had disagreements about these standards. So that was a red flag to me that people with that background have problems with these standards. Can
you tell me what some of their specific criticisms of the standards are?
From what I can tell, the early grades, they have designed the standards to make simple math concepts more challenging, I think, in an effort to, I'm sort of assuming that they're trying to get kids to think more about the math that they're doing. But what we're finding is that the time for that is later in life.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking 5, 6, 7 years of age. There's some brain development that has to go on first, right?
Right, they're saying learn your math.
Before you can get the complex.
You've got to learn your math facts. You have to know all of the basics like the back of your hand. Like if someone asks you what time it is, you know it. It doesn't interrupt your train of thought. If you're too confused about what the best way is to do math, by the time you get into algebra and higher math, if you're thinking still about how to approach the simple stuff, you're never going to master the higher level math. So those are some of the major complaints in the math.
There are just some things that you just have to know. I get that. All your facts, you just have to know them. Is it fun to learn them? Probably not, but you just have to.
Right, so you have to get through it, you have to memorize those things, and it becomes second nature, and so it doesn't interfere with what comes later. And they also push the requirement for Algebra 1 and 2 further along so that it actually makes it very difficult to get into a calculus course while still in high school. So once you find that these math skills start to play out, once you reach the high school level, the children are going to be very hard pressed to get into the kind of courses required for STEM careers and things like that. So those were his major objections to the math side.
So he didn't think they were correlated according to age, brain development, and then just the flow of them?
Yeah, so later on
there was a nice progression? Yeah,
the higher level math is not necessarily going to be attainable or for children thinking of going into the STEM careers. So that was the math side. Sandra Stotsky did a little bit more with the English language arts, identifying this replacement of your traditional literature with some of the like reading manuals or other informational texts.
Ooh, I don't even do that today.
So, I mean, I don't know that makes it easier for children to learn how to read when you're reading something like that as opposed to a classic literature to understand the language. You know, so
love of just words is a nice thing to have.
So there were some objections by some really smart people that caught my attention, and that's what got me involved essentially.
All right. So the standards were developed by people who were chosen by, Washington, D.C., and by different corporations who were giving money to the effort.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Essentially,
but without a lot of classroom teacher input. So there wasn't a group of first grade teachers from the Northeast sitting around and saying, these are appropriate to kids in the first grade. They can learn these things. They can master them. These were kind of imposed from some higher level, federal level.
Yeah, there were corporate interests. Achieve Inc. was one of the parties involved. The Council for Chief State School Officers and the National Governors Association were essentially the three groups that came together to write these standards. David Coleman was, who's now moved on to the SAT to redevelop that test, sort of oversaw the standards writing process. And that's exactly what they did. They brought in people from testing
academia
and testing companies, so that's where they came
Yeah,
from.
I have read some of the standards, I'll be honest with you, and I look at them and I say, can't they just say this in plain English so I know what they're trying to get, right? They're just, I imagine teachers are sitting there going, okay, all right, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Right? In
It's a
terms
challenge.
of these little bodies that are in front of me and their enthusiasm for learning, the language is just really difficult. It's not in plain language that people can just grab and understand.
I think Sandra Stotsky spelled it out pretty nicely when she said, all they did was take a number of standards and try to jam them all into one. And she's like, they're not even writing good sentences.
Yeah.
So
yeah, they're not.
It's a challenge, it really is.
All right, so we have these standards that we're not really sure do the trick for our kids. That they're not age appropriate, they're not content appropriate, they don't move the kids according to brain development and physical development and all this. But now we've taken a test and we've developed a test based on these standards. Is that right? That's what the PARCC test is.
The PARCC test is. So it creates certainly a problem. I sort of refer to it as, putting shutters on a house built on a poor foundation. I mean, the shutters you may think that look good, but what good are they if the house is falling down? One of the differences when it comes to the testing component, where you look at standardized tests that are typically administered, they're usually done by a third party. Mm-hmm. The difference with the PARCC and Smarter Balance, which is the other consortia, a number of states got together and made contracts to develop these tests, but the state was responsible for accepting the standards. They develop the test, they implement the test, they set the cut scores and then report on the cut scores.
Who does?
This is all overseen by the state, Rhode Island Department of Education, implementing these.
So our own Department of Education said, yep, we like the standards, yep, we like the test, and then
they administer the test, then they create the cut scores. So each state
So
has
what do you mean by a cut score?
A cut score is where you determine what the proficiency level is. So there's not necessarily a firm...
So our cut score could be different than it is in Ohio, or?
That's what I've been led to believe, and I think that takes a little bit further investigation, because it doesn't make a lot of sense. If you're really trying to compare one to the other, I mean, how do you do that if the states have their own criteria for making those decisions?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we have another one right now. Are you kidding me?